Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us Across the Fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. This month marks the anniversary of the landmark civil rights legislation called the Americans with Disabilities Act. The act was signed into law on July 26, 1990 by President George H.W. Bush, who declared, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." For 32 years, the legislation has increased access and opportunity for people with disabilities. To learn more, we're joined today by Peter Johnke. Peter is the Deputy Director of the Vermont Center for Independent Living. The center is directed and staffed by people with disabilities who are working together for dignity, independence, and civil rights. Peter, good afternoon, and thanks so much for being with us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So, in a nutshell, what is the Americans with Disabilities Act?
The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA as it's commonly called, is a law. It's a civil rights law that says you cannot discriminate against people with disabilities. People with disabilities should have the same equal access to places and to services that non-disabled people have.
And so there are a number of different parts to that. There's employment, there's local and state government to make sure they can vote. What are some of the things that it entails?
Sure. So there are 5 different parts, or titles as they're called. Title 1 is about employment. So this applies to employers who have 15 or more employees. In Vermont, actually, there is Vermont law that says you can't discriminate even if you have 1 employee. So it's a little different, but most of what Vermont follows is the same as the ADA. There's very few exceptions, such as this one. So this is where, employers can't discriminate against somebody based on their disability, can't prevent them from applying for a job or getting a job just because they're disabled.
Right.
And then part 2, or Title 2, is state and local government. And as you mentioned, they have to provide equal voting access to people. It's just one of the things, but this is for whether it's a town government, state government, all of those town and government services also have to be accessible to people with disabilities.
And then the third is public accommodations, which I think a lot of people know about because that's the whole restaurants and theaters and things like that, right?
Yes, exactly. And it covers just a whole, and any place that basically is open to business to the public also has to be open to business for people with disabilities. And as you said, restaurants and theaters, but even like bowling alleys, now swimming pools. So the whole gamut of any kinds of services and enjoyment, amusement parks, everything. So it really is opening up access to people with disabilities who didn't have it before.
Sure.
And then, telecommunications is the 4th part. And this is like relay services for the people who are deaf. That's the most common one that people think of. And this includes, so people who are deaf can access telephone services. And these are actually funded through universal access fee that's on your telephone bill. And it just also opens up the door. And this would also include, there are special services for people who have speech impairment. They can also use these services as well.
So what other, we've talked about a couple of disabilities that ADA covers. What else are we missing? What should we know about what it covers, who it covers?
So the ADA covers all kinds of disabilities, not just people in wheelchairs, not just people who are blind or people who are deaf. Disability is defined by the ADA as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. A person that has a history of or a record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others to have such an impairment. But the ADA doesn't specify every single disability. And the idea about the person perceived as having a disability, there may be somebody who maybe they had an accident and a fire, and so they have some pretty severe scarring that's visible on their face. And so an employer doesn't want to hire them for a receptionist position because they think, oh, well, this isn't going to look good. But that would be discrimination.
Sure.
So that's what it would be in terms of regarded, because they are, in a sense, disabled as not being able to do anything, but they will often be so that also protects those people as well.
Good definition. And how have things changed over the last 32 years?
So things have really changed a lot. I mean, people with disabilities now are able to access many services that they haven't been able to access before. Just getting in and out of buildings has been a great improvement. When the ADA first came out in 1991, well, it came out in 1990, but in 1991, standards were created. But the world changes. So those standards were updated in 2010. And for example, things were added that weren't in there in 1991, like now you have to have access to swimming pools. So those things are big improvements. And then things will change going forward. I mean, everything keeps changing in the world. One of the things that the United States Access Board is looking at right now is coming up with guidelines for accessibility for electric vehicle charging stations. Right now, many of the ones that are there are inaccessible because they're up on a pedestal and a person in a wheelchair can't reach them.
So interesting. So people talk a lot about the need for reasonable accommodation. Explain what that means.
So a reasonable accommodation really is an employee asking an employer, typically it's employee-employer situation, where they need an accommodation in order to do the job. And most accommodations are really simple. They may be changes in schedule. They may be minor changes in rearranging space. I can give you an example. At our office, we have people who are subject to significant migraines because of overhead lighting. So we just have the overhead lighting turned off and make sure everybody has more localized lighting. Simple solution, easy accommodation. Sometimes we have another staff person who uses a wheelchair who needed a desk that can go up and down. So there again, it's an accommodation. The employer probably wouldn't have such a desk coming in, but then this person comes into the office and says, well, in order for me to do this job, I need this desk changed. So that would be a reasonable accommodation as well.
Terrific. And how many people are we talking about, say in Vermont? How many have disabilities?
It's about 28%, which comes out to about 180,700, give or take. So my guess is most of the people out there probably know somebody who has a disability. So it's fairly prevalent. The other thing that's really important is that we think of people with disabilities as those that are really visible. People in wheelchairs, people using canes, people with a guide dog who are blind. But the vast majority of people have disabilities that are invisible. They have heart disease, they have diabetes, they have epilepsy, all kinds of things. That's really where most of the disabilities are, but nobody ever sees them.
Right. And is that percentage, that 28%, about the same nationally or even in New England? Is that pretty common?
It's pretty common. It's about 28% nationally. That's pretty common.
So what do you find are some of the real misconceptions about the ADA?
Well, probably one of the biggest ones in terms of business is business will say, we're grandfathered into the ADA, thinking they don't have to make their business accessible. And that's simply not true. There is no grandfather clause in the ADA. All public entities, regardless of size, must comply with ADA requirements. There is, however, provisions within the ADA that says if making something accessible creates an undue burden, typically it's too expensive, then they don't just have to provide an alternative way. And a great example of that is restaurants aren't required to have Braille menus. And the reason being is because menus aren't static, they change all the time. And so they have to constantly create all these braille materials for menus would be an undue burden. But wait staff can certainly read the menu to a person who's blind. So it's a simple accommodation, but that's a situation where that would apply in that.
Sure. And so who then enforces the American with Disabilities Act? Who's the enforcer here? How does that work?
So there are a couple of different federal agencies that do enforcement. The Equal Opportunity Employment Commission is responsible for Title I, which is employment in terms of enforcement. And then for public accommodations, it's the U.S. Justice Department is typically there. And in Vermont, if a person feels they've been discriminated against due to their disability, the Vermont Human Rights Commission can also take a complaint. But it's really important to understand that these organizations don't have, quote, a police department that runs around and looks at everything. Compliance is really done by you and me, people with disabilities, when they can't access a facility or they aren't getting services, then they file a complaint. And that's really what starts the process of making changes when a business or a government entity isn't willing to do that.
So the burden really is on the person to say, this is what I need, and how can we make that work out?
Exactly.
We just have a minute left, so I want to make sure that we get to how people get more information and learn about your organization. So quickly, how do people get in touch?
Sure. So to call the VCIL, Vermont Center for Independent Living, the number's 1-800-639-1522, or you can go to our website and contact us through that. It's www.vcil.org. We're happy to take any kinds of questions. We have a community access program that actually helps businesses and places of interest to make sure they're accessible. We go out and do site visits. We answer questions, all kinds of things.
Terrific. And you're not really a center where people can come. You are at several offices around the state, right?
That's correct. I mean, people are welcome to come into our Montpelier office. We are now open to that office is open to the public, and our other offices are slowly opening up as we get staff back in the office, back to pre-pandemic situations. So we do have offices, but we do a lot of work by telephone and Zoom and all those kinds of entities. So we're happy to connect any way that works.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. Interesting that the most common question is about service animals. So maybe we'll get you back, or people can tune into your site. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Stay well.